You know, a lot of what I do normally in a real classroom when we're going over some literature is whether we've read the piece or not. In this case, hopefully you've read it, right? You've read it, you've annotated it. I've already seen the annotations, which was one of your assignments. But whether we've read it or not, we kind of go through and read it as a class and point to some meaningful passages here that we can think about, discuss, and potentially use as you start to construct your own writing on these essays, right? I've mentioned this before, I'll just say it again. It's so important to understand the mutual relationship that exists between the reading that you do and the writing that you will inevitably definitely be doing, right? They really do go hand in hand. So another thing I wanted to mention here quickly before we get going here is, even if, and this happens a lot with literature, sometimes with nonfiction, obviously, even if we don't, if I point to a passage and I read it and we you know, start to see the importance in it, you know, sometimes we won't have everything laid out perfectly in front of us. What I can do as a kind of facilitator here, which is kind of how I see my role, is I can point out what seems to be some interesting and important parts and have you kind of further investigate it and, you know, interpret it, analyze it for some extended or some bigger meaning here. So, you know, at times I'll say, well, not sure what to make of that, but, you know, if you were to look into that a little bit more, we see something important. Now, getting right to it, the name of this module is Colonialism and the Individual Conscience. So a lot of this course, you know, the mainstay of this course is going to be socioeconomic injustice, poverty, socioeconomic disparity, right? But we kind of start going way back in history with colonialism, because that really does seem to be where a lot of this started to develop on a kind of global stage, right? Where you have imperialist countries discovering, you know, the new world and new parts of the world, and kind of laying claim to these territories. And as you will be seeing in E.A. Blair's piece, essentially just using them for resource extraction, for markets, so that they can build their empires, right? It's all about empire building. But the second part of that, right, so we talk about colonialism, but the next is individual conscience. Even if I am a part of an empire, at what point in time do I start to have a way of thinking that deviates from the empire? Or do I think like the empire as a kind of part of the empire entirely? Right in the beginning of this essay, on page 295, it mentions, and we're looking at Orwell shooting an elephant, he says, I was hated. I was hated by large numbers of people. And I think overall, kind of thinking about this essay in totality, which is what we do because you read it, right? So there's no spoilers here. But if you think about him saying, I was hated by some external source, right? These people, these Burmese people, I think we very quickly realized that that really should be, I hated myself. I hated myself because I was a part of this empire that was doing these things to this people, right? Exploiting these people and exploiting their land in such a way. So I was hated by these people. Well, maybe in due time we're going to kind of recognize that he really has a kind of hatred for himself, or at least a confusion about himself that might lead to some very uncomfortable feelings. He mentions also there on the first page, this is one of your questions, so we will be, when we do our web conferencing, when we do our CCC conference, this is one of the questions I look forward to talking to you about. He says the young Buddhist priests were the worst of all. That he despised these guys who really expressed a very similar hatred with all the other Burmese people toward Orwell as a kind of policeman of England within this territory. But for some reason it was the young Buddhist priests who were the worst of all. And the question that we'll be discussing is, well, why the Buddhist priests? Why are the Buddhist priests such a problem for him, or really get under his skin? And I'll leave that up to you. I'm going to read a quick passage here on to the next page here, 296. Right at the top of the page, it says, "All this was perplexing and upsetting. For at that time I had already made up my mind that imperialism was an evil thing, and the sooner I chucked up my job and got out of it, the better. Theoretically and secretly, of course, I was all for the Burmese and all against their oppressors, the British, for which of course we know he is a part of. As for the job I was doing, I hated it more bitterly than I can perhaps make clear. In a job like that, you see the dirty work of empire at close quarters." It's sometimes a common theme in literature, but I guess it extends to life in general. Here we have this nonfiction. If you are a kind of tool or somebody who is instigating the problem, in this case, he is a policeman of Britain policing this Burmese territory, you come to see the injustice perhaps even more than the people who that injustice is being enacted against, right? You are the perpetrator, you are the instigator, you are the one pushing forth this injustice. And with a kind of individual conscience that starts to generate, you recognize the problem more than, say, somebody who's just experiencing it, like the Burmese people here, right? Moving to the bottom of that page, he does use the word here in the last paragraph, beginning of the last paragraph. He does say, one day something happened, which in a roundabout way was enlightening. And that's an interesting word to hear, to have here. You've heard of the Enlightenment period, rational thinking. Thinking that really opposes nationalism, national pride, and it's more kind of intuitive with a human sensibility and a human sense of things, right? Case in point, I could say, when I think about America and the conflicts it is involved with around the world, the enlightened part of me, right? The enlightened thinking might be, well, forget national boundaries and national identity. I can correspond to, or I can understand the suffering that's taking place beyond these borders, right? And perhaps for some people, that's a more important thing to keep in mind than, say, nationalistic pride or nationalistic identity, right? And I think that's kind of what's happening here with Orwell, right? Moving on to the next page, again, just going to kind of pick apart some of the parts here. It says on page 297, in the second paragraph, just a little bit into it, it says, "That is invariably the case in the East," and he's talking about India, he's talking about Burma here. A story always sounds clear enough at a distance, but the nearer you get to the scene of events, the vaguer it becomes. Some of the people said that the elephant had gone in one direction, some said that he had gone in another, some professed not even to have heard of any elephant. He's talking about where did the elephant go, right? Which is this kind of literal feature of the story. There is this escaped elephant. We'll be talking a lot about the literal kind of occurrence of the elephant versus the figurative or the metaphorical understanding that we have of it. It obviously represents something broader, and I think there's a few things that it could represent here, and that's one of the big things that you have worked on in your discussion questions here. But before he gets into this elephant, he talks about this idea of, a story from a distance always sounds very clear, right? Think about it when you watch the news on an important news item that's happening around the world, right? Halfway around the world. If all you do is get your information from a very kind of convenient news source, whether it be, the TV or a newspaper, it all seems very clear, right? The report of that seems very clear to you. But if you were to actually get on a plane and travel into these parts of the world and investigate for yourself, you might get a bit confused. It becomes, as Orwell says here, vaguer, meaning harder to define, right? That there's not this kind of clear-cut, precise answer that explains things. Things are a bit vaguer, and I think that's what's happening with him in his time in Burma here. Is he's recognizing that it's a lot more complicated, right? There's a lot more that goes into it. And at the bottom of the page, there, it says, the people said that the elephant, and this is one of your questions, I believe, the people said that the elephant had come suddenly upon him round the corner of the hut, caught him with its trunk, put its foot on its back, and ground him into the earth. Now, when I'm reading this language, I'm always thinking about symbolic or metaphorical meaning. There's this story about this guy. One guy had a bad time with the elephant, as we know, a poor peasant, a Burmese man. And the elephant pretty much ran him over and ground him, as it says, ground him into the earth. It's very hostile, it's stifling, it's quite suppressive, right, to grind somebody into the earth like this elephant did to this man. Now, if we jump to some kind of metaphorical, meaning, we're talking about the very historic kind of context of colonialism. I think in many respects, and this kind of starts to get into the meaning of the elephant, what else is grinding somebody into the earth? Essentially pulverizing them, incapacitating them. It does seem like colonialism is doing that to populations, in this case here in Burma, right, or India, or other parts of the world where the British Empire is kind of grinding its way through these territories. So that's the first. It might be a little bit different later on, right? Now here's something that gets kind of choppy and complicated. The people, once they recognize, the Burmese people, the peasant population here, right, poor, don't have much, kind of just survive on a daily basis, right? E.A. Blair, I think, even talks about that. He's like, right now, there's enough to go around, but eventually the time will come when these people don't have a lot, and they're going to start to ask themselves about this empire and this whole setup. But it says right here, they had not shown much interest in the elephant when he was merely ravaging their homes. But it was different now that he was going to be shot. It was a bit of fun to them, as it would be to an English crowd. There's a couple things happening here, so let me just kind of briefly explain. Ravaging, hostile, grinding them into the earth. And ravaging, I think, is another verb that kind of corresponds to what the empire does. What does an empire do to a people that it's colonizing? It ravages them, right? It takes things away. It treats them harshly. So I think that language furthers the metaphorical value of the elephant as the empire. But it was different now that he was going to be shot. So what it's saying is that the Burmese people, they didn't have a problem with this at first. And you can ask yourself those questions. Why would a population that's being colonized not have problems with the empire as it's ravaging through their lands, right? And kind of making this claim to their land. But now that it's going to be shot, it's fun for them, as it would be to an English crowd. This is something that doesn't really get expanded upon too much, but I think it's something important to keep in mind, which is he makes the equivalent of the Burmese people here to the English people as well, as far as these massive populations that are finding spectacle in the destruction of this elephant here, right? He's making a comparison between them. It's the same for these Burmese populations as it would be for an English crowd as well. All right, so let's keep on going here, moving along. So let me just say one more thing here. How critical do you think? We know that he's critical of the British Crown. We know he's critical of the British Empire. We know he's critical of himself, right, and his kind of role in all of this. I think one of the key questions here to ask and to keep in mind is, do you think he's critical of the Burmese people themselves? If so, why? Why can we be critical of the Burmese people? Well, some potential answers, and you might have your own, are they don't stand up for themselves. Maybe they're a bit complacent in this relationship, right? You could argue, and again, these are all very debatable as I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, maybe they're too scared, too timid. A big part of who he is as a policeman in this area is his gun, right? I think he even mentions at one point in here that gun gives him so much power. And he's just one man with a gun being able to intimidate and kind of maintain control of hundreds, if not thousands of people, right? So maybe they're just easily intimidated. But that's a question to keep in mind here. Is he being critical, right? Is he providing a criticism of the Burmese people themselves? Okay. Make sure you don't turn savage again. Okay. Okay, let me read through this. This is on page 299. And I'm just going to read through this. This is a pretty important paragraph, so I'll just start from the top. First big paragraph. But at that moment, I glanced round at the crowd that had followed me. He's got this whole following of these people. It's kind of a strange situation. It was an immense crowd. 2,000 at the least, and growing every minute. It blocked the road for a long distance on either side. I looked at the sea of yellow faces above the garish clothes. Faces all happy and excited over this bit of fun, all certain that the elephant was going to be shot. They were watching me as they would watch a conjurer about to perform a trick. They did not like me, but with the magical rifle in my hands, I was momentarily worth watching. And suddenly I realized that I should have to shoot the elephant after all. What's created his need to shoot this elephant, he doesn't necessarily want to do it, is the crowd around him. It's almost like this pressure that now he has to follow through with it, right? We know later on, I could ask the question, well, why does he feel this pressure? Later on, he explicitly says it. He says it very clearly. He says, because it's what they expect from me as a functionary or as a tool, as a soldier or a policeman, however you want to look at him, of the British Empire. This is what they expect for me to put this down, and that is what I will do. Now, this leads to the ulterior, and I think perhaps the more perhaps even purposed metaphorical value of the elephant. There are many examples that you can say the elephant itself, this big kind of hulking menace that boom, 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 kills this man, pulverizing the earth. There's many examples, there's many details here that you could say, well, it's the British Empire itself, right? Even when we get into the horrific and, prolonged death of the elephant, right? He's putting bullet after bullet after bullet in it. You could still even argue, and I've seen this analysis as I read up on this, that it is the British Empire dying out, which it eventually does. It can't necessarily hold like this kind of octopus, right? You can think of the British Empire like an octopus with a tentacle here, a tentacle over here, just all over the world. Eventually those tentacles start to kind of lose their grip and they recede, and the British Empire loses power, and therefore the colonies can't survive. Now it's time for a new colonial power. A lot of people would argue America kind of takes over, right? That England passes the torch, especially after World War II, to America, the USA, and they start to be this widespread colonial power because they have the means to do so, but that's a whole nother issue. But I think the more interesting way of thinking about this elephant here, especially with the people saying, especially because Orwell, as the narrator here, feels as if he must put it down. Now we're talking about the elephant as a metaphor for the will of the people to stand up for themselves, to oppose British colonialism. E.A. Blair mentioned this. You took, and you've already taken the quiz. I'm seeing how all this stuff is gonna, I don't want to give any answers for the quiz, but you've already taken it, right? The way that's when we'll put this lecture. E.A. Blair even says that the biggest fear that the British Empire has toward its own kind of security or occupation of that region is young, educated men and women. Of course, this was probably a time period where there was more educated men than women. So that's the biggest fear, right? Young, educated men. And he goes on to say, E.A. Blair goes on to say, it's because educated men understand the suffering that's going on. For some reason, education does this, and I don't know how correct that would be, but that's what they put forth. Education allows you to be critical of the suffering, to be very aware. It's an awareness. Education is an awareness that people are suffering, perhaps you are suffering, and the next logical step is to do something about that suffering. And in this context, it would be to oppose British colonialism, right? To do something about it. So back to Orwell here, he says, I have to put that elephant down, right? They expect me to do it. In a weird kind of twisted kind of way, you can look at it as the Burmese people expect to be dominated, right? They expect this violence from somebody like, and this kind of threatening violence from somebody like Orwell as a tool of this colonialist empire. It's only what's expected of him, right? And therefore, he must deliver. We'll talk more about the idea of the elephant being the will of the Burmese people when we get into the elephant dying, right? Which is a pretty prolonged kind of horrific scene, but we'll get there in just a moment. He ends that, I'm just going to read this entire paragraph because I do think there's a lot of importance here. Just checking the time here, 3:50. We've been at this for a good 20 minutes, so we still got a good amount of time. I'll just keep it going. The people expected it of me, and I had to go, and I had got to do it. I could feel their 2,000 wills pressing me forward irresistibly. And it was at this moment, as I stood there with the rifle in my hands, that I first grasped the hollowness, the futility of the white man's dominion in the East. He starts to see that it's not pointless, but that it will not last, right? It's futility. It is futile. It's weak, believe it or not. And there's a lot of irony there, right? To say that the strength and might of the British Empire within the context of colonialism, he's saying it's weak. It can't last. Again, the next question would be why, right? And I think we could provide, hopefully we will, in the discussion at the end of the week here, we'll provide some good answers about that, right? Here was I, the white man with his gun. What an interesting marriage there, right? When you think about colonialism, the white man must be with his gun. That's what creates this possibility in the first place. Here was I, the white man with his gun, standing in front of the unarmed native crowd, seemingly the leading actor of the piece. He says a couple of weird things there too. He likens it to a theater, that he's the leading actor. And a part of me, when I look at these words, when I see these terms, actor, theater, crowd, it makes me think of like British theater as well. And we know that theater has a very rich and might even be kind of the origins of theater, right? Aside from the Greeks and all that kind of stuff, a big, rich theatrical history, right? History of theater. So that's an interesting thing he does there. Moving on. But in reality, I was only an absurd puppet, pushed to and fro by the will of those yellow faces behind me. I perceived in this moment that when the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom that he destroys. I'm going to repeat that line because it's repeated in many important writers' works. I perceived in this moment that when the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom that he destroys. You'll hear this in the abolitionist movement as well in America, right? The emancipation, freeing of slaves, which is ironically, and it's a heavy point of irony, right? Which is, you know, who is slavery the worst for? Well, literally, in a very kind of physical sense, it's worse for the slave, right? That makes perfect sense. He's in bondage, no opportunity, a violent and threatened kind of existence, right? Obviously, it's worse for the slave. But who is slavery worst for? Morally and ethically, it's a no-brainer. The slave owner, right? Who is colonialism worse for? Again, physically, literally, yes, the people who are being colonized. But again, we go back to enlightenment, some kind of heightened thinking that sometimes is in tune with kinds of, morals and ethics, right, most of the time. Who really suffers in this process of colonialism? The tyrants, right, the colonizers themselves, morally and ethically. And he's just making that point there. He becomes a sort of hollow, posing dummy. The conventionalized figure of a sahib. For it is the condition of his rule that he shall spend his life in trying to impress the natives. And so in every crisis he has got to do what the natives expect of him. He wears a mask, and his face grows to fit it. He wears a mask and his face grows to fit it, right? I walk into this job as policeman in this area. I am supposed to be threatening. I am supposed to be intimidating. I am supposed to be this kind of clear presence of the empire. And then the face grows to fit that mask, meaning he embodies it. That morally and ethically, he becomes that threatening and fearful kind of feature of the society, right? You grow into it. And that's problematic, obviously. And he's realizing that right now. Moving on. I had got to shoot the elephant. I had committed myself to doing it when I sent for the rifle. A sahib has got to act like a sahib, and a sahib is man. A man has got to act like a man. He has got to appear resolute, meaning, determined, right? To know his mind and to do definite things. To come all that way, rifle in hand, with 2,000 people marching at my heels, and then to trail feebly away, having done nothing? No, that was impossible. The crowd would laugh at me, and my whole life, every white man's life in the East, was one long struggle not to be laughed at. Now that's a point out of kind of left field, unexpected for me, reading through this piece, and maybe for you as well. But it's an interesting point, and we're going to discuss it more in the CCC conference, which is why is he so afraid, literally in this context, why is he so afraid to be laughed at? We'll get our ideas out there. On a broader level, why are people from the West, especially as these world-dominating powers, right? These domineering kinds of countries, why are they afraid to be laughed at? What do they got to lose, right? And I think that's one of the questions that we'll deal with in the conference that we have. Real quick side note, as we look at the time here, 3:57. We've been at this a good 30 minutes. I probably will extend this for another 10, 15 minutes because I do want to read the part with the elephant dying. Please feel free. As you can see, I'm using, I got all my equipment here. We're tripoded up. I do have a microphone here, so I'm hoping that the audio is very clear. I hope I got everything in frame here decently. If you're the people watching this, if you have any suggestions how I can kind of situate this a little bit better, or I'm having some mic issues, please let me know. That's probably going to be the best way that I can find about these particular issues. If you don't like my shirt, that's not much I can do about that. It's a limited wardrobe, but things like that. So let me know if there's anything I can do to make this a more conducive experience, right? To make it more effective for you. All right, so let's move on here. And we're going to get to this elephant here right now. All right. All right, I'm going to start on page 300 at the very bottom. This is right after the paragraph where he says, if he charges me, I could shoot it. Right? If this elephant charges me, if it opposes me, I will shoot it. So let me start at the bottom here. The crowd grew very still. And this is right after he gets ready to shoot it. The crowd grew very still, and a deep, low, happy sigh, as if the people who see the theater curtain go up, there he is again, right? And that at this point is almost a motif, him talking about theater, that this is an act of theater, right? That we are learning something from the actions of this man in almost a theatrical kind of way. Breathed from innumerable throats, they were going to have their bit of fun after all. It's strange. Now, going back to this with big question, what does it represent? What does the elephant represent? Two things. I think you can go in this kind of two different directions here. One is, it is the empire. It is the British Empire. And why would the people be happy to see the British, this elephant, aka the British Empire, get killed? That one speaks for itself, right? You are ridding yourself of this colonialist power that has, dominated you for decades, right? So that one makes perfect sense. However, the more interesting one, I think, is if this elephant is a metaphor for the determined will of the Burmese people to rise up, right? To rise up and oppose the British one way or the other. Why are they so happy to see it killed? And that goes back to what we mentioned earlier in this small lecture, which was is Orwell being critical of the people themselves? Are they cheering on and rooting for their own demise? Are they cheering on and rooting for the elimination of their own will to rise against somebody like Britain, right, who has this power over their country? Again, two ways to look at this metaphor. Moving on, they were going to have their fun after all. This was going to be fun for the people. The rifle was a beautiful German thing with crosshair sights. I did not know then that in shooting an elephant, one would shoot to cut an imaginary bar running from ear hole to ear hole. I ought, therefore, as the elephant was sideways on, to have aimed straight at his ear hole. Actually, I aimed several inches in front of this, thinking the brain would be further forward. Now, it could be a reach, but you could argue that he's shooting for the brain literally because I'm sure that's a great place to shoot if you're going to lay down an elephant. It's probably one of the more exposed areas, especially if it's charging you. But shoot for the brain in terms of thinking, right? To limit or to somehow damage or destroy the thinking of the elephant. In this case, what could be the thinking of the Burmese people themselves, right? Especially as a potential force to rise up against the British. So the brain is interesting there. Literally and figuratively, you can make some points. Moving on to the next page. When I pulled the trigger, I did not hear the bang or feel the kick. One never does when a shot goes home. But I heard the devilish roar of glee that went up from the crowd. And devilish is never a great word to be used. It provides a negative connotation, meaning the crowd is being depicted in quite a negative way, and that's being very vague in general, but it is being depicted in a negative way there. In that instant, in too short a time, one would have thought, even for the bullet to get there, a mysterious, terrible change had overcome the elephant. all of a sudden there's this big, mysterious, terrible change to the elephant. He neither stirred nor fell, but every line of his body had altered. He looked suddenly stricken, shrunken, immensely old, as though the frightful impact of the bullet had paralyzed him without knocking him down. At last, after what seemed a long time, it might have been 5 seconds, I dare say, he sagged flabbily to his knees. His mouth slobbered. An enormous senility, meaning he was senile, like old age, extreme old age, and the effects of it on your thinking set in. Right? His senility seemed to have settled upon him. One could have imagined him thousands of years old. Thousands of years old is interesting. I'm always making this connection of the elephant to the people, or if you want, the connection to the British Empire itself. Thousands of years old is interesting because it could be the empire, but I think it's also probably the people, right? The people themselves are thousands of years old. And all of a sudden, as it's going down to its knees and it's in this very tragic state, Orwell's recognizing the inherent age, thousands of years old, of this elephant, which could be of the people themselves, starting to have a real understanding of the people, their history, and the fact that England perhaps is, a guest at best, guest in this country, and not the kind of guest you would necessarily want. E.A. Blair does mention there were some economic benefits to having Britain there, and we can talk about those in the discussion at the end of the week. Moving on. I fired again into the same spot. At the second shot, he did not collapse, but climbed with desperate slowness to his feet and stood weakly upright, with legs sagging and head drooping. I fired a third time. Nothing stops him from choo-choo-choo. He's not going to stop firing, right? That was the shot that did it for him. You could see the agony of its jolt. You could see the agony of it jolt his whole body and knock the last remnant of strength from his legs. But in failing, he seemed for a moment to rise, for as his hind legs collapsed beneath him, he seemed to tower upward like a huge rock toppling, his trunk reaching skywards like a tree. He trumpeted. Normally when we hear trumpets, it's a sign of glory, some kind of glory, for the first and only time. He trumpeted for the first and only time. And then down he came, his belly towards me with a crash that seemed to shake the ground even where I lay. Again, there are these kind of divergent ways that you can look at the elephant here as the empire itself that is now dying out and having lost its claim to these very economically profitable regions in the world, or this kind of will of the Burmese people. And I'm quite split, to be quite honest, because I think it could go in either direction, especially what we just read. The elephant literally rises up one last time, right? He's taken on this pain. He's been shot. It's tragic, but he rises up one more time for some kind of trumpet skyward, right, heavenward, and then of course he falls. So I think you could see it as the empire, one last kind of hurrah, or it could be of the people themselves, right, that it will not be defeated, that even in this kind of case of agony, in this kind of tragic scene, there will be this last resurgence. Into the next paragraph, and then we can call it a day for this lecture. I got up. The Burmans were already racing past me across the mud. It was obvious that the elephant would never rise again, won't rise again, but he was not dead. There's this eternalness to the elephant, despite its physical life. It will not end. He was breathing very rhythmically. Rhythm takes me back to an author named James Baldwin, who uses it in Sonny's Blues, a beautiful short story. But the idea of a rhythm is that it keeps pace and it doesn't die out, right? As long as there's a rhythm, like the heartbeat, da-doom, 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 it will always be present. It will live on. It will endure, etc. He was breathing very rhythmically, And we call that diction when precise words are used, right? With long rattling grass, his great mound of a side painfully rising and falling, his mouth was wide open. I could see far down into caverns of pale pink throat. I waited a long time for him to die, but his breathing did not weaken. Just going on and on and on, right? Just living and living and living. Finally, I fired my 2 remaining shots into the spot where I thought his heart must be. It's time to put an end to this. Whatever it represents, I must put an end to it, right, for the heart. The thick blood welled out of him like red velvet, but he still did not die. Velvet is a word commonly associated with wealth and riches and royalty, right? Because velvet, especially back then, it was an item that was, not easy to get your hands on, right? It was really kind of for the rich, for the wealthy. So that would, maybe that's the idea that it's the British, but maybe you could say it's the Burmese people too. His body did not even jerk when the shots hit him. The tortured breathing continued without a pause. He was dying, very slowly and in great agony, but in some world remote from me where not even a bullet could damage him further. The elephant is kind of removed aesthetically, spiritually, mindfully. The elephant is somewhere else completely, and all this physical pain that Orwell, as soldier, policeman here, is inflicting upon it, it's not doing anything to him in those regards, right? Do what you will to my body. Thoreau, Martin Luther King, purports this message. Do what you want to my body, jail me up, abuse me, right? Whatever. This is somewhere else, untouched, untouchable, right? I felt that I had got to put an end to that dreadful noise. It seemed dreadful to see the great beast lying there, powerless to move and yet powerless to die. That's a contradiction, right? That's a paradox, which is a contradiction of kind of ideas, but rings true. How it is powerless to move, but it is powerless to die, right? Not going to move, going to stay right there, but not going to die either, and not even to be able to finish him. I sent back for my small rifle and poured shot after shot into his heart and down his throat. They seemed to make no impression. The tortured gasp continued as steadily as the ticking of a clock, enduring, right? A clock, tick, 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 moving on and on and on. We'll just read the last paragraph here and wrap this up. Afterwards, of course, the owner was furious, but he was only an Indian and could do nothing. That's kind of a reference to the fact that Indians don't have any power here, right? There's no power. Besides, legally, I had done the right thing, for a mad elephant has to be killed. A mad elephant, a mad people, right? Don't forget, this kind of a good piece is going to come full circle and reference some of the ideas that were already established for us early on. What did we learn in that very first paragraph? The people hate him. They are mad. They are angry. And here he says, a mad elephant has to be killed, like a mad dog, if its owner fails to control it, right? Among the Europeans, opinion was divided. The older men said I was right. The younger men said it was a damn shame to shoot an elephant for killing a coolie, because an elephant was more than any damn Korangi coolie, right? And afterwards, I was very glad that the coolie had been killed. It put me legally in the right, and it gave me a sufficient pretext for shooting the elephant. I often wondered whether any of the others grasped that I had done it solely to avoid looking like a fool. And there's the question that we'll be discussing in the conference, which is, why did he have to do this, right? Why is he so afraid of looking like a fool? Looking like a fool, how, right? And why? Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.